If you've ever done very much Angular programming, you've almost certainly come across the idea of two-way binding, the so-called banana in a box. But most likely, you've seen examples of it using ngModel. Well, that's very useful, but there are situations when we want to do our own two-way binding on our own custom components, and that's what we're going to look at this week. So what I've got here is a fairly simple application where we have the idea of a spaceship, so from some kind of game application that has a name, a number of hit points, and a coordinate, and then the coordinate is simply X, Y, and Z. So that's the spaceship put together. Then I've got this spaceship editor whereby we're listing out all that data just for reference so we can see what's happening. And then we've got, at the moment, just a way to edit the number of hit points. So this is the classic example. There we've got the banana in a box, so the round brackets, the banana, the square brackets, the box, and that gives us two-way binding through ngModel because we've got this input element, and Angular built in has ngModel on inputs and selects and text areas and that sort of thing. And all we've got then is we create this spaceship at a particular location, and then as it stands at the moment, we'll be able to change the hit points through there. And if we look at the running application, there we can see exactly that. So we've got the name, we've got the hit points, we've got a default position, but the only thing we're editing at the moment is if I change the number of hit points here, we can see it's being reflected. So that's two-way binding. One way from the data to the template is that the initial value 100 comes out there, and then the other way from the template to the class is that when I make changes, I've got that. So let's see if we can do that on our own component. And what I've also got here is we've got a coordinate editor component. So the coordinate editor takes in a coordinate as an input, and then in the template for this one, we've simply got, again, 3 more input elements for the X, Y, and Z coordinates. And again, just the standard two-way binding on that with ngModel. So if we incorporate the coordinate editor into our spaceship editor, we should be able to see what's happening there. So what we'll do is just pop in a div, and then inside the div, I'll just have a label that will say position. And then after the label, we'll have another div that I'll give a class of indent, which I've predefined just to keep this a bit tidy. And then in there, we're going to put our app coordinate editor, and we're going to start with, just do one-way binding. So we're going to take the coordinate that we defined inside the app coordinate editor and bind that onto spaceship.position, which is the name we had for the coordinate in there. So if we put all that together and then save that, we should now be able to see back in here that we've now got the coordinate editor, and we can see it's displaying the correct position 5, 2, -7. So the one-way binding has worked. But the thing is, if we start changing these, will the change in the child, the coordinate editor, be reflected in the parent, the spaceship editor? Well, let's see. If I start moving it up, perhaps a little surprisingly, yes, it is changing. So although we've only got one-way binding, we can actually still apparently change what's in the child and have that reflected in the parent. But the reason for that is what we have bound onto is a reference to the coordinate. So when in here we said coordinate is spaceship position, that simply takes a reference to the position. So what we refer to as coordinate in our coordinate editor is actually the same object as the position in our spaceship editor. So just like we've seen in some earlier videos talking about C#, when you pass things by reference, if you change the reference, then clearly you're going to change the original. So it may seem like we don't need to have two-way binding because the one-way binding is working okay on a reference. And for the most part it will. But what if we decided to do something like this? What if here, let's put in another div, and in here let's put in a button that will label reset. And then the button on its click, we will just call on reset, which doesn't yet exist, but we'll then go into here and we'll do an on reset. And all that's going to do is say coordinate equals new coordinate. So notice what I'm doing there. I'm not setting the coordinates of the existing object all to 0. I am replacing the existing coordinate with a brand new coordinate. And if we do that, then we'll see that we've got a problem, because now we can still change those and the change gets reflected above. But if I do a reset, now we've disconnected the coordinate in the child, in the coordinate editor, from the one in the parent, the spaceship editor, by saying what we had there, new coordinate. So it's a brand new one now, and so any changes we make in the child are to its own local coordinate, not to the parent one. And so that's the sort of situation where we actually do need two-way binding. We need to notify the parent that not only have the contents of the coordinate changed, but the coordinate itself has changed. And we can start doing that by using an event. So we've got one-way binding from the parent to the child using an input, but we can have an output and an event to have the communication from the child to the parent. So let's go and put that in. So our child, remember, is the coordinate editor. So as well as having the input of the coordinate, let's have an output. And this one we'll call coordinate change to indicate a change in the coordinate. And then we're going to set that to a new EventEmitter, which is generic for the data type we're going to send to the parent, which in this case is going to be a coordinate. So that's set up our output. And then the one thing we've got to remember to do is when we change the coordinate in the child, we've got to notify any parents who are interested. So here we've got to say this dot coordinate change dot emit, and then the new value that we're emitting, which is this dot coordinate. So we've now got to tell the parent that we've got a brand new coordinate. And then on the other side, in the parent, we can bind onto that, this time using the round brackets. So here we can say coordinate change and then equals, and then very simply all we want to do is say spaceship dot position equals, and then we can just use $event, because whenever you've got an event, you're given the event parameter as $event in there. So let's just lay that out a bit more clearly. So we've got the square brackets to bind the position with the parent to child binding, and then we've got the round brackets to bind the event, which is the child to parent. And so this $event is going to be the coordinate that we passed in there, and so we're setting it back into the position. So if we save all that, then we'll see that now that should work. So that's obviously still working, but I press reset, and we can see that up here the position went to 0, 0, 0, and we're still connected, and if I reset it again, it changes again. So that's achieved effectively two-way binding, but it's done it by having two separate instances of one-way binding. So this one does the parent to child, and this one does the child to parent. So it's working, but it's not quite there. What we want to do is have our banana in a box. So I want to be able to put the round brackets inside the square brackets, get rid of that bit completely, and then have it so that if we save all that, we still get the same behavior, that when I press the reset, it goes to 0. And it has. It just worked, apparently. It's a kind of magic, and nobody really likes magic in any software environment. We want to understand what's happening. And what's actually happening here is just a tiny little bit of a cheat, that if I were working here in a C# environment, I would be kind of disapproving of this, but it's the way they managed to get it to work in Angular, because what it does is it works on a naming convention. The fact that I called my output coordinate change, so the input is coordinate, the output is coordinate change, that is the naming convention that makes this work. So it's a bit of a cheat, but it works fine. But you can see if I were to get that wrong, if I were to say coordinate changed on that, and also obviously change it down there, but now if I save all that, you can see we're getting an error here, which isn't saying very much. If you look at the screen, it actually tells us a bit more. the property and event halves of the two-way binding coordinate are not bound to the same target. So it's a long-winded way of saying it, but basically it can't find how to do the round brackets bit because we called it coordinate changed, not coordinate change. So it's just a naming convention, but got to stick to it. And so if we do that, then we'll find it all works happily and we get our two-way binding. So it's really very simple what's happening there. It's just effectively a code substitution. So when we put the banana in a box, what it assumes we're doing is we're actually writing a square brackets on coordinate and a round bracket on coordinate change, but we can just simplify it to doing it all in one go. So if you have a reference type, we saw initially you can get away with a lot of stuff just using the one-way binding with the square brackets parent to child. And that will work if you're modifying the object internally, but not if you're replacing the one object with a different object. If you're doing that, you're going to need to do two-way binding, and you might as well do it following the convention, so have whatever it is and whatever it is change, and then you can use the banana in a box. On the other hand, if you're using a simple data type rather than an object, like a number or a string or something like that, then you'll have to do the two-way binding because changing it will actually replace the one object with another, and so you'll always be in the circumstances that we have here. So that's quite quick. Hope it was helpful. Not something you see in lots of documentation and courses on Angular, but can be a very useful thing to have. If you want more Angular features, then do let me know in the comments. Do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.